The air in the High Command spire usually smelled of ozone and the sweet, crisp vapor of the atmospheric scrubbers. Today, it smelled of nothing but cold tolly leaf tea. Archon Kalen looked down at the porcelain cup sitting forgotten on the edge of the holographic map table. A thin, translucent film had formed over the dark amber liquid. It was a small, domestic failure in a room dedicated to the prevention of planetary extinction. Beneath the spire, the capital city of Ethelgard shimmered like a fallen constellation. The Athelian people had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of the curve, building a civilization out of pearlescent stone and light. Now, the outer colonies were winking out. On the map, the red icons of the Vorix advance moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. They did not pause to consolidate. They did not stop to pillage. They simply consumed and moved on. Kalen's iridescent scales, usually of vibrant seafoam green, had faded to a dull, limestone gray. His secondary heart thudded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The honorable mercenaries of the High Command were currently downstairs in the feasting hall, arguing over the spoils of a war they were already losing. They spoke of duels and ancestral blades. They were decorating their own coffins. If the sky turned to ash and the only hand reached out to save you was stained in blood, would you take it? Would you prioritize the purity of your soul over the survival of your children? Because the shadows are coming for Ethelgard, and honor is a very poor shield against the dark. 3 levels below the Archon's lonely vigil, Princess Alara stood on the observation balcony of the great docking bay. The wind whipped her silk robes against her shins, but she didn't feel the chill. She was watching the arrival of the Terran Shadow. The other mercenary ships were works of art, slender, gilded needles that hummed with musical frequencies. The Terran shuttle was a jagged, matte-black scar against the morning sky. It didn't hum. It growled. As the heavy boarding ramp hissed open, a scent drifted toward the balcony. It was the smell of scorched circuitry and old, pressurized oil. It was the smell of a machine that had been pushed far beyond its intended limits. A single figure stepped out into the blinding, Athelian sunlight. He wore no ceremonial armor. No banners fluttered from his shoulders. He was dressed in charcoal gray fatigues that looked as though they had been slept in, or perhaps died in. Commander Elias Thorne looked up. His eyes were not wide with the usual wonder of a first-time visitor to Ethelgard. He didn't marvel at the floating gardens or the crystal spires. He swept his gaze across the defensive turrets, his mouth thinning into a hard, professional line. He looked like a man counting the seconds until the walls fell. Back in the command center, High Warden Valerius slammed a fist onto the map table. The holographic projection of the Creo's Delta system flickered and hissed. Valerius was a warrior of the old blood, his scales a proud, metallic gold that had never seen a day of true, desperate combat. "We have the vanguard of the 7 moons," Valerius barked, his voice echoing in the vast, silent chamber. "We have the knights of the solar flare. We do not need a scavenger from a backwater system to tell us how to hold our own borders. It is a matter of tradition, Kalen. We meet the enemy in open space. We show them the strength of our resolve." Kalen looked at the High Warden. He looked at the gold scales that had been polished until they shone like mirrors. He thought of the reports coming from the fringe. The Vorix didn't care about resolve. The Vorix functioned on a biological frequency that bypassed traditional radio entirely. Their hive mind utilized a quantum-entangled neural web, allowing a scout ship on the edge of the galaxy to transmit a target's exact coordinates to the main swarm in less than 3 milliseconds. While the Athelian fleet was busy sending formal challenges over wide-beam frequencies, the Vorix were already reconfiguring their cellular hulls to absorb the specific heat signatures of Athelian plasma cannons. It wasn't a war of strength. It was a war of processing speed. "Our tradition is a death sentence," Kalen said softly. His voice was a dry rasp. "The Vorix are not warriors, Valerius. They are a landslide. You do not challenge a landslide to a duel." Alara watched from the shadows of the corridor as the human commander was escorted toward the High Command. Up close, Thorne looked even less impressive. He was smaller than the Athelian guards, his movements lackadaisical and devoid of the stiff, military posture required by the court. But as he passed her, Alara noticed the device clipped to his belt. It was a small, battered translator device, its casing dented, and the paint chipped away to reveal a dull, heavy metal beneath. It looked like a relic from a museum, an ancient piece of tech that should have been recycled decades ago. Yet, Thorn's hand hovered near it with a strange, possessive twitch. It was the only thing on his person that looked well-maintained. She followed the party at a distance, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She had read the forbidden intelligence reports from the Terran borders. The stories were nightmares wrapped in technical jargon. They spoke of liquid death traps and the cold calculus, of human generals who would sacrifice an entire moon just to lure a swarm into a gravity well. The Athelian scholars called it tactical butchery. Thorn stopped at the entrance to the Great Hall. He didn't wait for the herald to announce him. He didn't bow to the icons of the founders. He simply walked into the center of the room, his heavy boots thudding against the pearlescent floor with a sound that felt like a sacrilege. The high command went silent. The mercenaries, draped in their silks and jewels, turned to look at the newcomer. Warlord Braca, a massive warrior from the Ethelgard moon colonies, let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated in Kalen's chest. "Is this the monster of Earth?" Braca sneered, gesturing toward Thorn's plain attire. "I have seen dockworkers with more formidable presence. Tell me, human, did you forget your sword, or are you planning to bore the Vorix to death with your drabness?" Thorn didn't blink. He didn't even look at Braca. He walked straight to the holographic table, his eyes fixed on the red stain of the Vorix advance. He reached out and tapped a coordinate on the Creo's delta line. The map zoomed in, showing the proud, golden formation of the Ethelgard Third Fleet. "Your honor is a luxury," Thorn said. His voice was flat, devoid of the musical lilt of the Athelian tongue. It was a sound of stone grinding on stone. "And you're about to run out of it." He looked up then, meeting Kalen's gaze. For the first time, the Archon felt a shiver of genuine, primitive fear. Thorn's eyes weren't filled with hatred or even anger. They were filled with a terrifying, hollowed-out clarity, which meant the Ethelgard line wasn't just thin. It was an invitation. "You're holding a parade while a predator is smelling your blood." Thorn continued, his gaze drifting back to the map. "You have 6 days until the Vorix hit the Delta. If you stay in this formation, the engagement will last exactly 42 minutes. Most of that time will be spent watching your ships melt. You dare?" Valerius stepped forward, his hand moving toward the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "You stand in the heart of Ethelgard and insult our lineage." Thorn finally looked at the High Warden. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even tense his muscles. He just stood there, a shadow in a room made of light. "I'm not here to insult you," Thorn said. "I'm here to make sure there's someone left to remember your lineage. But if you want to die for a tradition, don't let me stop you. I've seen plenty of honorable species turn into space dust. They all look the same in the end." Kalen felt the room holding its breath. The iridescent scales on his arms began to prickle, a biological warning signal he hadn't felt since he was a hatchling. He looked at the cold tea. He looked at the map. Then, he looked at the man who smelled of burnt oil. The transition from honorable defense to tactical butchery was not a gradual shift. It was a cliff edge. Archon Kalen watched from the spire as the Athelian fleet, once a shimmering curtain of golden defiance, broke its perfect geometric formation. Under Thorn's direction, the ships did not stand and fight. They slunk into the long, jagged shadow of Ethelgard's largest moon, Creos Alpha. It was a maneuver that felt like a retreat, a coward's gambit that left the inner colonies exposed like soft tissue. High Warden Valerius stood at the edge of the map table, his scales vibrating with a frequency of pure, harmonic outrage. In the silence of the command center, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic clink of a porcelain cup. Kalen had picked up the cold tolly leaf tea again. He wasn't drinking it. He was simply feeling the weight of the ceramic, a mundane anchor in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. He thought of the Vorix, a name that meant the many in the old tongue, and realized that his people had spent centuries preparing for a war against an empire. And the Vorix didn't negotiate with food. They just ate. The plan was a humanized nightmare. It was a false surrender, a tactic so devoid of honor that the Athelian captains had to be ordered by the Archon himself to comply under threat of immediate decommissioning. Princess Alara was the center of the trap. She was sent in a small, unarmed diplomatic shuttle toward the Vorix flagship, her signals broadcasting a message of total capitulation. To the Vorix hive mind, This was not a gesture of peace. It was a notification that the prey had stopped running. The universe was hungry. As the Vorax swarm descended on the helpless shuttle, Thorn sat in the shadows of the command spire, his eyes fixed on a small screen that showed nothing but scrolling green code. He wasn't looking at the ships. He was looking at the Predator logic. The human-engineered signal, a jagged burst of digital noise disguised as a distress frequency, was already being broadcast from Alara's shuttle. It was a Trojan horse designed to exploit the very quantum-entangled neural web that made the Vorax so efficient. The high-pitched whine of the human-engineered signal tore through the bridge of the flagship, vibrating the very marrow of the Vorax warriors as their internal sensors screamed with false data, forcing their automated defense turrets to lock onto their own support frigates in a cascade of technological betrayal that no Athelian mind could have ever conceived. The convergence happened in a heartbeat. The Athelian ships leaped from behind the moon, their cloaks dropping not to fire plasma cannons, but to launch boarding pods. Thorn's thumb hovered over the trigger, a silent, heavy command. On the bridge of the Vorax flagship, the war leader, a towering mass of chitin and sensory stalks, turned toward the human guard standing beside the kneeling Princess Alara. The human wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing the face of a man who had already seen the end of the world.